Trenches were there? Zero. Here's the bottom line. O'Reilly and the GOP are a lot of bark, but no bite. They attack these problems, but they don't offer solutions. And by now, these problems have been built into the very structure of our society. So to talk about all this, I'm bringing in our two guests. I'm very honored to have Beverly Daniel Tatum, president of Spelman College, and Congresswoman Karen Bass from California. Thanks to you both.
Thanks for having me on.
Congresswoman, I want to start with you and sort of the politics here because, you know, the food stamps issue that we've been talking about quite a bit, I mean, it further hurts the situation. You see the GOP's plan now is to cut $40 billion in cuts, 5.1 million eliminated from the program. You know, you contrast that with their rhetoric. It doesn't quite match up, does it?
No, it doesn't at all. And frankly, when I heard about Paul Ryan's tour that he wants to take in inner cities, I really think that's about collecting a number of photo ops to inoculate himself from the 47% for a future presidential run. Paul has written his philosophy down, and he basically really feels that we need to restructure our safety net to the point where we really will be hurting people terribly. So he believes that we don't need government programs, that churches and nonprofits should play that role, and that essentially subsidies and tax breaks should be given to the wealthy.
Which, as I understand it, the data has actually already shown that the private sector can't make up the difference from what the government does. You know, the Atlantic Magazine took a look at how House Republican constituents are actually impacted by food stamp cuts. Republicans tend to represent plenty of food stamp recipients, but unlike many Democrats, not nearly so many that they'd ever have to worry about them at the polls, which again, Congresswoman, this feels like this is about politics. This is about, and it also, I think, shows the schism between the rhetoric in the House and some of the rhetoric in the Senate.
Well, I'm absolutely right. You know, they do represent plenty of poor people, but at the same time, they're also trying to do everything they can to restrict people from voting because they know ultimately, you know, they could be in trouble in that way. I really think that it's sad. I mean, if you look at the amendments that they attach to food stamps that would essentially say if you've been a pedophile or a murderer, I mean, it shows the contempt and who they think poor people are to begin with. They don't recognize the fact that the majority of the poor work. They have jobs. They just don't earn enough money to provide all of their expenses.
Well, and again, I think it's so disconnected, right? They don't actually even understand how it works. And Beverly, in the historical context, you know, we're talking about food stamps, but, you know, it goes much deeper than that. And the reasons for the kind of inequities that we see today and that people are, you know, trying their hardest, I think, to, you know, pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But to some degree, there's a real historical context as to why that is much harder than sort of the simple broad brush that we hear from the right.
I think it's really important to understand that history, and it's so clearly missing in this conversation. For example, let's talk about housing. If you think about the fact that most Americans count their house as one of their best assets, and the appreciation of it is something that they rely upon, particularly if they want to fund a child's education, for example, to go to college. But if you think about the GI Bill and the benefits that so many veterans got to help them buy housing, over a 30-year period from the mid-30s to the 1960s, the federal government spent $1.2 billion to help mostly white veterans purchase homes in suburban communities that were segregated by racial covenants. The FHA had racial restrictions in those loans that created white suburban communities and confined Black and Latino and other people of color into urban communities where housing properties depreciated, suburban communities appreciated, and that's made all the difference for some people in terms of, for example, being able to send their kids to college.
Right.
But most people don't know that history.
Well, and they also don't, as I think you've pointed out, they don't know the history, but they also don't seem to understand what does that mean in the modern context. What, you know, what has that led to, given where we are now? And again, I think there's such an oversimplification. You know, Congressman Bill O'Reilly also has gone on and on about black-on-black crime. It's another area where I think, frankly, he oversimplifies. Now, back in January, we heard Mr. O'Reilly's solution to guns, not to ban them, but dealing with sentencing. Take a look.
Obviously, the gun ban in Chicago doesn't work. Do we all get that? What would work is a 10-year mandatory federal prison term for anyone convicted of any gun crime in the Windy City or anywhere else in America. Rob a 7-Eleven with a gun, 10 years in the federal pen. Illegally possess a gun, same deal, 10 years. That's how you keep guns off the street.
And you know, Congresswoman, I mean, you know, from a PR standpoint, right, that sounds good, but think about, when I think about what happened, you know, with the drug sentencing, that didn't work. And there was no thought to the fact that these kinds of laws would be disproportionately affect and impact African Americans or communities of color. And we've got some information up on the screen in terms of race and sentencing. 2.3 million incarcerated, total African Americans incarcerated nearly 1 million. And so the rate of incarceration for African Americans nearly 6 times the rate of whites. So it's not as simple as to just say, let's just broad brush apply one solution.
No, absolutely not. And I think that, you know, Bill O'Reilly seems to have really degenerated into just hate speech almost. And I think that that's really too bad. We have a long history in this country of inequity when it comes to the criminal justice system. And we went through the drug war. And to talk about the disproportionality, you know, we know that African Americans and whites use drugs. Actually, white folks use drugs a little more than African Americans, but yet the sentencing and the arrest is completely disproportionate. A lot of it is a class issue in terms of who can get legal representation, but just like the other guest on who said that people are not interested in history. This is an ideological fight, it's a political fight, and it's winning brownie points on where we allocate the government's resources, because unfortunately the Republican Party that's in power right now really doesn't believe that the government should provide any resources for poor people, because poor people are poor because it's their own fault. Right. There's plenty of jobs, they just won't go find them, and also because people are living too comfortably on government support. So, you know, in your last segment you talked about people not having a clue about race, but they also do not have a clue about class. They don't have a clue as to who the poor are or how poor people live, and the fact, like I said before, the majority of the poor work. They have jobs.
So, and I want to just switch, we have just a little bit of time left, but Beverly, I want to talk about that, because one of the other places where we see great inequities is with regard to health care, and the GOP wants to defund Obamacare. They voted a 40th time just yesterday. But I was interested in what you've done at Spelman College, kind of recognizing the needs of your students and sort of trying to figure out what you can do. Can you talk a little bit about that program?
Sure. We call it the Wellness Revolution at Spelman, and really what it is a campus-wide wellness initiative encouraged to help students eat better, move more, sleep well, the 3 pillars of health, recognizing that this is a generation that it has been highly sedentary. We know from NIH studies and others that, for example, black women, the demographic that we serve at Spelman, half of them are coming to us from high school having been pretty sedentary without pursuing any physical activity, leisure physical activity at all. There are a lot of reasons for that. If you live in a neighborhood where it's not safe to be outside, you're not going to spend much time walking. But we also know that there is perhaps an illiteracy, not of the reading, writing kind, but illiteracy of relative to health and wellness. And we have 4 great years to take advantage to really help change that. And we know Spelman women will influence others and to really change the demographic, the trajectory for their health over their lifetime.
Well, no one can say that the two of you aren't working hard on these issues. Thank you, Congresswoman Karen Bass and Beverly Daniel Tatum of Spelman.